This evening is our keynote speaker. We are honored to have Mr. Vivek G. Ramaswamy from the class of 2003, founder and executive chairman of Rovient Sciences. Vivek started his freshman year at St. X in 1999 after attending Princeton Public Schools through 8th grade. During his time at St. X, he was active in a wide range of activities ranging from mock trial to the varsity tennis team. He graduated at the top of his class in 2003 and matriculated to Harvard, where he studied molecular biology while also serving as the chairman of the Harvard Political Union. His senior thesis at Harvard won the largest prize awarded by his college, graduating summa cum laude in 2007. He then started his career as a successful biotech investor at a large hedge fund in New York, where he became the youngest partner in the firm. He then earned a JD from Yale between 2010 and 2013, while continuing his work as a biotech investor. In 2014, he left his career as an investor to found Rovient Sciences, a successful biotech company. 2 drugs advanced by Rovient were approved by the FDA in 2020. Earlier this year, he stepped down as CEO to become executive chairman of Rovient, as he now focuses on his forthcoming book about capitalism, democracy, and American identity, to be published in August and available for pre-order online. He has emerged as a prominent national commentator on these topics over the last year. In his personal life, he met his wife during his time in law school, where she was his next-door neighbor as a medical student, and they had their first baby son last year. Please welcome Mr. Vivek Ramaswamy from the class of 2003.
Thank you all, and it is a pleasure to be back here nearly 2 decades later. I'm going to kick it off by telling you about my first job that I had in high school. My first job was to be a ball boy at the tennis tournament in Mason, Ohio, the one that's right across the street from Kings Island. It was a pretty sweet job. Now, I loved it because you got to watch all the players up close. Got to watch Andre Agassi, the top players in the world, and for me, Agassi was my top hero. But there was always somebody I was especially jealous of on that job. It was the announcer on center court. He got to sit courtside. He didn't have to chase balls in the heat. He didn't have to hand players their sweaty towels. I wanted that job. Now, the only problem is the guy who usually had the job is a properly trained guy in his 50s who has a voice made for radio, who could be trusted to speak over a megaphone to a stadium full of 10,000 people. So I had to get creative. Now, I knew they weren't going to give me the job if I just walked up and asked for it, so I tried a different tactic instead. I picked up the phone and I called him. I spoke in a deep voice. I told him I had done some radio, which is true. I'd done that during my time here at St. X, and they seemed pretty impressed. They didn't ask for my age. I didn't volunteer it. Thankfully, we didn't have Zoom back then. And to my surprise, they offered me a job there on the phone, saying an opening had just come up, and I accepted it right on the spot. So let's just say when I showed up for my first day on the job, they were a little surprised to see a scrawny teenager and realize they'd made a very bad mistake. But I gotta give them a chance. I gotta give them some credit. They gave me a chance. And in fact, they even gave me a chance to introduce none other than my longtime hero, Andre Agassi. They figured he's a senior at St. X. He clearly knows how to read. We're gonna give him a script. What could go wrong, right? The only problem was that I didn't like their script very much. It didn't do justice to the finesse, the skill, the legend of Andre Agassi. Did these guys even know who he was? So I decided to make up my own script instead, and here's what I said. It was something like this. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the only player on tour to win all 4 Grand Slams, the last American player to win the French Open, and the greatest player in the history of the game, Andre Agassi, and he's playing some Swedish guy named Magnus Norman on the other side. Now, I thought it was pretty great. Only problem is it was totally inappropriate. And that is the story of how I got fired from my first job. It turns out I didn't learn my lesson. As you heard in my introduction, I've founded a biotech company, but what you may not know is that the first drug that we developed was an abysmal failure. It was a drug to treat patients with Alzheimer's disease. The entire pharma industry had tried for decades to develop a drug for Alzheimer's. And so at the ripe age of 28, I decided that I wanted to take my crack at proving everybody wrong and develop a drug that I thought looked promising. It was a promising drug, I thought. It ended up becoming one of the highest profile drugs in all of pharma. I ended up leading what ended up being the largest biotech IPO at the time in 2015 on the basis of that single drug. I was on the cover of Forbes magazine. It was actually pretty controversial. The entire scientific community was debating it. In fact, they were waiting on the edge of their seats to see whether that drug was going to work. And for my part, I thought I was actually, by the age of 30, within striking distance of changing the course of medical history for the better for these millions of patients who suffered from this terrible disease. So in 2017, we finished the trial, we turned over the cards, and it turned out to be a failure. The drug didn't work. And personally, it was devastating for me. I'd done well here at St. X. I'd graduated near the top of my class at Harvard. I'd left a comfortable career as a biotech investor behind to start this company. And then here I was, failing on this scale, more gargantuan than I could have ever imagined. I was supposed to give a speech to my employees to tell them about the results. And as I was practicing in front of my apartment that morning, I ended up breaking down in tears, and I just sat on the bathroom floor for a good half hour before heading into the office. I went from being a daring young rebel to being the guy who took a big risk and failed. I was panned in the biotech press. My peers and my competitors relished it. But eventually that experience strengthened me. It even gave me a sense of freedom. It taught me that if I was free to fail on a scale that big and still survive it, then I was free to fail on an even bigger scale the next time around and still be fine in the end. And that realization encouraged me to keep taking big risks. And eventually, we did get drugs approved. Eventually, we did get drugs to patients. The one I'm most proud of is a new FDA-approved drug for prostate cancer. And that little startup I founded in 2014 ended up becoming a multi-billion-dollar company. So that's my first piece of advice to all of you. Be irreverent. Take big risks and fail. It'll be the most rewarding thing that you ever do. It's what allowed me to succeed in my own career. But here's my second piece of advice, and it's one that I wish I'd done a better job of following in my own career. When you encounter hardship, you don't have to deal with it alone. You can rely on your community to lift you up. It's actually a lesson that I first learned here at St. X. There's two moments that I distinctly remember our community coming together as one. The first one was on a small scale during my freshman year in scriptures class with Mr. Slater. He's since retired, but he's actually here with us tonight. Mr. Slater started every class with a prayer. And before he started his prayer, he'd ask us if there's anything we ever wanted to pray for. If it was a Friday, somebody might raise their hand and say, I hope we beat Elder at the football game tonight, or maybe I pray that I do well on my math test later today. There was a kid in class named Brett, big guy, muscular guy on the football team, sat in the back of the class, never raised his hand, never said a thing. He'd just smirk when the rest of us raised our hand to pray for something silly. There's another kid in the class named John. He sat in the very front of the class, and he raised his hand every single day. And every single day, Mr. Slater would call on him. And every single day, John would say the same thing. He said, I'd like to pray for my mom. And every day, Mr. Slater would just nod with a smile. Now, we didn't know it at the time, but it turned out that John's mom wasn't doing too well. And one day that December, John didn't show up at school. He didn't show up the next day, and he didn't show up the day after that either. And on that third day, Mr. Slater started class the same way he did every day, asking the class if we wanted to pray for anything. And then something surprising happened. Brett, that big guy in the back of the class, raised his hand. And he said, I'd like to pray for John's mom. I came to St. X in 1999 to go to a school where I could pursue excellence without having to apologize for it, where we could be proud rather than ashamed of pursuing excellence. And I definitely found that here in spades. But in that moment in my freshman year, I found something that I didn't know I was going to find at St. X. I found a community that lifted each of us up when we needed it the most. The second moment that I remember was a couple of years later, in 2001, when I was in history class with Mr. Zeff. Another teacher opened the door, stuck his head in the classroom, and said, "They got us. They hit the second tower at the World Trade Center. They hit the Pentagon." I remember Mr. Zeff paused for a second, threw out his lesson plan for the day, sat there with us in the class, turned on the TV, and we just watched it together for the next hour. We didn't just learn history that day. We were part of it. As awful as that event was, and as much as we wish nothing like that ever happens again, I miss the feeling that we had as a community, both the St. X community and the American community at large, because for just that moment, it didn't matter if we were black or white, Democrat or Republican, Catholic or Hindu, St. X grad or Muller grad. We all faced that tragedy together. Well, as I was preparing for tonight, I realized that you're the first graduating class in history here at a commencement where not a single one of you was born on the day that those two planes hit the Twin Towers 20 years ago. For me, it's a part of my high school experience. For you, it's a fact of history that Mr. Zeff teaches you from a history book. And that brings us to this year. You're graduating in the year 2021 after going through a once-in-a-century pandemic. More people died in America this year from COVID-19 than died on that day in 2001 on 9/11. You faced restrictions on interacting with your classmates. You've lost a lot from a season of spring sports last year, to fine arts, to the spring dance that you won't get back. But just like 9/11 brought us together 20 years ago, at least at St. X, this year's pandemic did the same thing. Your teachers voted with their feet to come back here and teach you in person, even if that meant taking some amount of personal risk for themselves. TX may not have been able to put on its annual fall play, at least in the fall, in a live manner, but you were able to channel your creativity to do it by video in a way that would have been previously unimaginable. We had the most successful athletic season of all time, winning a staggering 10 GCL championships. Kairos and the mission trips still happen, and here we are at a live commencement to celebrate the beginning of your lives as St. X graduates. So what's the moral of the story? Well, I hope the last year of your experience at St. X taught you the same thing that St. X taught me. Hardship is inevitable. That's just real life. You all encountered hardship this year, and you're going to encounter hardship in your lives beyond St. X. And when you do, you're going to have a choice to make. Will that hardship break you, or will it make you stronger? I've made my choice. It's what allowed me to succeed in my career. Hardship is not the same thing as victimhood. Hardship is what teaches us who we really are. But remember the second lesson too. When you encounter hardship, you don't have to deal with it on your own. You can lean on the people around you. If you have a strong community, you'll bounce right back and you'll do something great. Y'all went through hardship this year. You had a great community around you. So now go do something great. Thank you. God bless.